Welcome back to SDP Talks. My guest today is commentator, broadcaster and associate fellow at Civitas, Emma Webb. Now Emma, you've written and presented an excellent new film called Britain's Silent Cultural Revolution. So broadly, just to kick off, what is Britain's Silent Cultural Revolution?
So we used the title Britain's Silent Cultural Revolution to try and capture what we're seeing and have been seeing for many years now in some of Britain's major cultural institutions, libraries, museums, and this particular ideology that has taken hold. And the reason why we called it a silent cultural revolution, though admittedly it hasn't been particularly silent, it's actually been very loud, is because it's something that has sort of seeped into these institutions, and it's something that's been referred to by some as the long march through the institutions. But actually in the course of doing the interviews for the documentary, we found that it was actually a lot more complex than that. It was something that had happened sort of more organically. These ideas had been taken on board, ideas that originated in American universities and partly in French postmodernism, and that these ideas had then, seeped into various aspects of the people who are essentially the custodians of our cultural heritage. So the people who are supposed to look after our heritage, but now see it as something that needs to be deconstructed, picked apart, judged, or even edited and done away with.
It seems to have happened quite quickly, doesn't it? And that's the curious thing. Although, as you're right to say, the seeds of all this stuff go right back to, postmodernist thinking and 50s, 60s, or beyond. Actually, it's nothing new in that sense. But it's curious, isn't it? And it seems to have just happened. I think what's happened is a lot of very young activists are in these institutions, and the curious thing is that the leaders of the institutions don't really always believe in the things that they're pressed into doing. The pressure's applied and then they just give way to it. Do you think that's a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think people are frightened. There's no sort of resistance there, partly because the costs are so high if you do question what has become this orthodoxy. And I think it's a bit like the classic frog in a pan that's getting hotter and hotter. That the groundwork was laid as these ideas took hold, and I don't think people necessarily understood the implications of those ideas or the general direction of travel. And so I think that there is a certain it's not just actual cowardice, but there's a certain intellectual cowardice in some of these institutions where it's a bit like the emperor's new clothes. No one wants to say that these ideas are balmy or they don't make sense. Because I think nobody wants to be seen as being ignorant or unsophisticated. And so a lot of these ideas, if you think about sort of the French postmodernist people like Foucault or Sartre, that their ideas are so convoluted and impossible to understand, the jargon that they use to express these ideas, that I think people feel intimidated by that, and that may be one way that people have been sort of just soft to the influence of these ideas, and there are some people who are sort of like real true believers in them, and there are other people who just want to get on with doing their work, or they just enjoy working in museums and so on, and they want to keep their heads down. They don't want to get fired.
There's so much pressure on that, and I think it's just easier in every single outburst, every single issue that comes to the press, and there's an issue about this and an issue about that. It's just easy for these bodies and committees and custodians just to give way each time, and there's no cost of doing that. And as you say, the cost of standing up to some of this stuff, even though it is crazy, a lot of it, they're just terrified of being cancelled. But I just want to get at the fact that I don't think the people that are at the heads of the National Trust and these other institutions of the church would necessarily actually believe in this stuff, this sort of extreme progressive modernism, or whatever you want to call it. Lots of terms for it. They don't always believe it, but they feel pressured into doing it. And I think what worries me is that, and I know Eric Kaufmann's said in the past that it's a concern, because actually what will happen when the real militants, who are the younger ones, because quite often the younger people are doing the social media account and these issues come up, and then what do we say? And so they'll decide, and the older ones will go along with it. What happens in 5 years, 10 years time, 15 years time, when these institutions are actually people at the helm have these views? Do you think that's a concern?
Yeah, I think the worry is that it's such a monoculture that it's impossible to have. I mean, there is no real diversity of thought, and if it is, it's hidden somewhere. And because there's such an intellectual monoculture, any sort of free thinker or dissenting thinker finds themselves immediately in hot water. Yeah, and so there might be people in the younger generation who don't agree with these ideas and would like to challenge them, or even sort of on an academic level, it's very. I mean, can you think of any serious critiques of some of these ideas? I mean, from within academia, I think it's the older generation. Perhaps I think some of them are as committed to these ideas as the younger generation.
You see, I sense that may be the case in some institutions, but I think they're less zealous about it. I think there's a lot of giving way. I mean, if you look at institutions like, I don't know, some institutions like the FA, for instance, now I can't honestly believe that the FA's, which is a series of people with blazers on up and down the country running football, I can't believe they buy in wholesale to BLM's sort of Marxism or anti-family stuff. But they just are terrified of not giving into it.
Well, I think it's interesting because with the FA, and probably actually this might be the case across the board, I think there's confusion about what is going on. And I think that was one of the key motivations for doing this documentary for the New Culture Forum, which is that we wanted to explore exactly what is going on and speak to some of sort of the greatest thinkers on this subject, to try and understand the nuances of exactly what this phenomenon is and what it means. Because I think part of the challenge is that people don't really understand where these ideas come from, what they actually mean. And so in instances like the FA or in the church as well, I think the church is a good example of this, they misconstrue it with old civil rights thinking, or just plain anti-racism. And so there's a kind of rhetorical trap door in all of this, where it can be a bit like it can be like St. Paul. It can be all things to all people, but ultimately it does have a particular origin. It does have an actual canon of thought that has roots in French academia and in American universities, and is being added to every single day in our universities. And I think that people are not aware of exactly what those ideas are and where they come from, and because of that, people are sort of more susceptible, because they're not racist, and they don't want to be seen as racist, and these are just happen to be the mainstream sort of orthodoxy around anti-racist thinking.
No, I see that. Then there is some of the arguments are quite subtle. I mean, in the case of Foucault, actually, I think as a philosopher, it's worth reading him anyway, because actually you can turn his basic theory that everything's about power and everything's reducible to power is actually a very good lens to look through and to understand what's going on. Because of course, in an institution, if everything's about power, then you find out where the power exists when you look at who has to give way to it. Who constantly. So actually he's quite good. But just to get back to what you said about importing ideas and the origin of some of these ideas, I think this again, last summer's sort of moral event, after George Floyd was killed, is a really good example of this, where you've got a whole canon of thinking, and you've got a civil rights movement from from day dot in the United States, in a particular set of circumstances, and then an event happens, and in the Anglosphere particularly. I think we're particularly vulnerable to it in a way that the, say, Southern European culture isn't. You don't see so much wokery, terrible word, but you don't see so much of it in Portugal and Italy, slightly less in France as well. But the Anglosphere has been very, very vulnerable to this wave of, just importing American hyper-racialism and dropping it, almost in a period of a few months, dropping it into the UK. And what's been disappointing, are you disappointed at how little resistance our culture has been able to put up against that? It's just fallen. It's
hard to be disappointed if you expect it, because the groundwork has been laid so much in terms of the dominance of a particular American way of thinking. If you just, all you have to do is, pick any show at random from Netflix, which is where most young people consume their media from. And it's deeply embedded because it's a world. It is a worldview. It's a new worldview, and I think we're at the cusp of an entirely new way of thinking about the world, and that's why I actually think that the term woke is insufficient to describe what we're seeing, because it doesn't do justice to what these ideas actually are. It
and
almost
their origins.
it downplays their seriousness, because it is an intellectual school of thought. It is a worldview. It's not sort of just glib political correctness. It's a sort of interesting phenomenon that should be taken really seriously and actually assessed academically, rather than, I think, what is a tendency to just assume that it's neutrality, and particularly because it has become the dominant worldview
so quickly
and even with people who are critical of it, you'll see they'll take on board certain aspects of it, or certain parts of the language that come from it have become mainstream, and it's the same as the way that any worldview throughout history has spread and become mainstream.
Dominance. And it doesn't have to, and critically actually, it doesn't have to be, some of the core ideas in it don't have to be true. I mean, some of them don't even have to be very, in an instrumental sense, they don't have to be very useful either, but it still washes over. It's like a wave that you can't resist. What interests me partly is the intersection between, I shouldn't have said intersection, should I?
You just did it.
It's one of their words, but the relation between politics and this cultural stuff, because what you've got is I mean, it's an obvious. I'm not having a cheap dig at the Tories in this, but you've got all of this stuff in the institutions has happened under. By and large, you had the coalition, but you had, basically 11, 12 years of Tory government. And it's happened in front of them. And they've been largely either indifferent or unaware of what was happening, or if not those things, just unable to stop it. What's going on there? I mean, is politics just completely impotent to this?
I think part of it is the confusion again. I think people didn't know what they were seeing, and it was just something that sort of gradually seeped into people's way of thinking. It seeped into policies, into the way that our institutions view their own purpose. And people have been talking for, decades about our cultural self-loathing, the fact that the West is running out of steam, that we've lost self-confidence, and if you think about the discussions that were taking place in the early 2000s about multiculturalism or about political correctness, all of these things, preceding the 2010s when these ideas started to become much more popular. So it's not something that has just sort of happened. It's something that, has a long tail to it, and it's been gradual, and it's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't think that it is as straightforward as just as some people have said about the long march through the institutions, that it's just this concerted effort. I think the whole phenomenon is much more complicated than that, because it's almost like sort of, I think George Orwell used this analogy when he was talking about the way that language ends up becoming woolly and misused, but it's a bit like soft snow just falling onto everything.
But Orwell also mentioned that, famously mentioned that the English culture, it's only in the English culture that the intellectuals really, really despise their own culture. I mean, the level of self-hatred is there. And actually, when you meet people that think it's just bang, it's just arrived, I think you make a brilliant point. You need to think about where it comes from. And actually, I think in English society, really, it's the Norman conquest. I'm not joking, because now I'm not joking. I'll make a case. You had this division between the governed and the govern, and those that govern us, and that sort of division is still there. I mean, it's, apart from anything, it's still there in the families, and it's the little hints and resonances which you can see from it. In my own county in Northumberland, you see it. It's actually who owns most of the land. Well, think about 1066. But it also is a cultural difference, because the attention, the preoccupations of a certain class in this country is totally detached from the. So what you have is the Norman and the Saxon. I think that's. And in the moral panic of last year, I think one of the best observations that I heard. I don't think he published it actually, but Aris Roussinos, who writes for Unheard brilliantly, he described this, the wave, the sort of BLM wave and the cultural event as North Sea Protestantism.
Yeah,
I think, what do you think of that? Do you think that's a good...
it's a really interesting point, and I was actually
Puritanism.
just about to say that I think that, you know, you could even find roots of it in the Reformation.
Yes.
And you could find, to some degree, and this was something that we discussed in the process of making the documentary, is that there's an element of the perversion of Christianity about it, not just within the church specifically, but things like, you know, guilt and original sin without redemption.
Yes.
And the sort of self-flagellation,
performative stuff.
It is, it's almost Pharisaic in the biblical sense. It's praying on the street corner.
And there are a lot of I think a medieval Reformation observer, looking at some of the events, I mean, there's set pieces, some of them in the States, you know, would recognise it for what it is, which is a religious event in a sense, and belief, and human beings will always reconstruct. I mean, I think obviously one of the I don't have an answer to this because I'm a sort of a non-believing cultural Christian, I'm a churchgoer, but I don't think I can believe. But I don't know. I don't think we've found an answer to what we do with the comprehensive loss of our religious belief system in the West. I don't know what we do about that, and I think that's obviously left a vacuum. And do you think that some of the things that are happening now are just filling the vacuum? Absolutely,
yeah. I think, I mean, not just here, but all around the world, not even just in Europe, that modernity left a kind of vacuum that has been filled with what, and I think this particular worldview is one of them, political religious ideas. Yes. It's a strange fusion of worldviews that preceded the modern period. And I think that is actually the first step in taking it seriously, is that we need to actually take the history of these ideas seriously and look at them in a detached way rather than from the inside. And I think that is really important, because when we just refer to things glibly as being woke, there's an idea that, you know, these are like just frenzied activists who are malign or malevolent. They're trying to tear down our culture, but I think it's so much more complicated.
No, it is so good you say that, because I think they are, and I think it's important that you also. I mean, I think that many of the activists are mistaken for lots of reasons I'll probably go into, but I think an approach which tries to knock down the sincerity of their intentions is wrong. Because I think a lot of people, a lot younger people particularly, are really, really very, very committed to this stuff. And I think the problem is that it may be a failure of the education system, because as you say, there's very little viewpoint diversity now. You know, in the social sciences, virtually none. So no one's ever put the sort of cultural conservative approach to society and institutions to too many of these people. So what you get is, you know, this process of deconstruction, you know, and we've seen, as you say, we've seen it for a long time. You deconstruct the nation state, you deconstruct family life, you know, religion has to be got away with, and now, you know, the latest thing quite recently is to deconstruct the idea of male and female. So you've got a project of deconstruction that people feel passionately about, but the problem is they don't have anything. There's not a clear idea of what we replace it with.
Yeah, I think it's intimately connected to what Pascal Bruckner called the tyranny of guilt. And like I said, people have been talking about that for a long time. And I think, like you say, it is, it's a cultural thing. So even, you know, people in my generation and younger have been marinating in a different culture to the one that our grandparents were sort of weaned on. And it is a case of really, and this is why you need to deeply understand the ideas, which is something that, you know, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose have made great efforts to do.
Yeah, great.
You need to understand the roots of the ideas so that you can see where it conflicts with other worldviews that also have roots here. And the best way to resist against ideas that you think are bad isn't necessarily always to just criticize. That's what they do.
Yes.
Is to present the alternative and to say, well, actually, no, I think this is a better way of looking at it. This is a healthier worldview.
Exactly, and in particular, don't go for the person. I go for the ideas, because this is a question of ideas, fundamentally. No, I get that. I think that's right. I think it's try and unless the ideas can be tackled and dealt with. I mean, my criticism. We are a party of the centre left, and economically, that's our heritage, and we still have it. It's very important to us. So we're not. It's funny how the lens that the identity lens that people tend to look through now and encouraged to do so, it often leaves out the question of social class. So you're not allowed to really think about that and think it's important. We think it's highly salient because all of this cultural revolution that you're talking about quite often is dreamt up by reasonably privileged people who are not likely to come into direct contact with the consequences of some of these ideas. And they're knocking down institutions and cultural guardrails without any thought that some people might need the guardrails.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that there's a sort of there is a very large degree of cultural ignorance in it, because and this is a point that Rod Dreher made in his brilliant recent book, Live Not by Lies. And we stole that quote for the documentary. He interviewed people from former Soviet countries about their interpretation of the signs that we're seeing in society at the moment. And I think people don't see it, they don't recognize it, and that was why we wanted to sort of present some of that historical background to see the analogies there, because throughout history, revolutionaries, whether it is under Mao, the French Revolution, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda when they or the Taliban when they destroyed the famous Buddha statues, that revolutionaries always attack heritage. They always attack culture. They go for statues, they go for people's cultural identity, because they want a tabula rasa, they want a clean slate. Exactly, they want year zero, or what Orwell calls the endless present, because then they can build their new society from scratch. And you see this in this new way of thinking, which is that everything about society is bad, and all of it has to be scrubbed clean because the problem is systemic. And if the problem is systemic, then the only way to mend society is to start from scratch. And so you need to do things like tearing down statues, changing our institutions, and undermining culture. And really the only way that you can do that ultimately is, as people who have come before us have done, is through burning books, or as they did during the actual Cultural Revolution in China, through destroying bourgeois musical instruments and even pets.
And nothing is beyond the lens, the scope of this. I mean, that's the curious thing. But the thing is, it does fall apart. I mean, morally, if you analyse some of the actions, just the actions, it really does fall apart. And look at a recent-ish event, when they renamed Gladstone Hall at Liverpool University, and we've got members that are academics there, and sort of warned us what was likely to happen. And of course, the shortlist of the people that were going to replace him was fixed, and we still can't find a vote. We're going to have to do Freedom of Information or something on Liverpool University to find out how they did this. But what happened? They got rid of a 19th century free trade liberal. And they named the halls after a communist. So presumably, Gladstone's family obviously had an association which they were unhappy about, but they replaced it with a communist who, so the gulags don't matter. That's the crazy, and actually any morally competent person must see that as in its own terms, just a retrograde step.
It's also guilt by association, isn't it? So it's not necessarily what the individual did. Gladstone wasn't a slaver. No. It's by various degrees of association. There was a primary school who wanted to change its name because it was called Rhodes Primary School.
Wrong Rhodes.
But it wasn't after Cecil Rhodes, but they still wanted to change it because they were worried about the association. So, it's the same with Wordsworth, because his brother was on an East India Company ship. The degrees of, or even, like the example of Rudyard Kipling, using themes of empire in his literary work, and that is a reason to put his house on the naughty step from the National Trust. The degrees of separation get increasingly, and you see this with other revolutions as well. The French Revolution, eventually it came for Robespierre. It always eats itself.
A sea of blood, and you don't get that.
And it starts with this sort of guilt by association, because with this worldview, there is nothing that is beyond the remit of what it can swallow up. Because once you're wearing those sort of revolutionary goggles, you see the problems in absolutely everything.
And actually terms are invented to draw things in that are loosely associated, because they say it's adjacent to whatever. That's the language that
we saw this literally yesterday with this monkey in Hartlepool. The monkey that apparently could be offensive and make people think that Hartlepool is xenophobic, when it's a brilliant tale of a monkey that.
And actually, Hartlepolians are quite proud of that. And the account of that on the headland actually happening. Did they think it was a French sailor? Did they not? It's a lost in the mist of times. But actually, as a cultural thing, it's quite a big thing in Hartlepool. No, it's a strange thing. It's a strange world we live in. I think one of the things that's interesting me is as you say, the role expansion. An institution that should have a prime role, say the National Trust or the Church or the FA, should be primarily concerned with training, in the FA's case, primarily concerned with organising football, organising the rules around football. Kick It Out was a reasonable campaign, was very successful. But there seems to be, you're not content with that. You have to get into sort of mainstream, broader politics. So the institutions really can't stick to their knitting.
Well, that's sort of Hannah Arendt's point about totalitarianism, isn't it? That an early sign of that is that every area of society gets politicized. It's not good for every aspect of society to be seen as political. And I've seen this, time and time again on social media, particularly on Twitter, people saying, but surely every area of life is political. Well, that is not a given. That is a sort of an assumption that now seems to be quite widespread, is that it's not possible for things to not be political. But that comes from the worldview that politicizes everything, that sees everything as part of the system, that is problematic.
And if you've only got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, and so there isn't anything to it. That's the problem. I don't know where. I wish I had a little bit more faith in the direction we're going. One point that's worth making we're going back to Foucault actually, is that if it's all about power, you can't deny that these people have power, because they clearly do, massive cultural power, but they don't have hegemony. They don't, in the sense that they control institutions, they control what those institutions do and the decisions that are made, but actually they don't have hegemony. They don't really control what people think, because actually there's a difference between what these institutions are doing and saying and what we would call popular hinterland opinion. Would you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's probably where the disdain comes from. It's very similar to what happened after Brexit. They are, I would say, the sort of intelligentsia, or you call them the cultural elite, despise people who don't agree with them, and will go to great lengths to demonize them, rather than actually engaging with their ideas, because I think they ascribe a sort of moral value to opinion, and so because they truly believe that they are right and there is no other way of thinking, the majority of people who don't agree with them, who are saying, hey, wait a minute, you're supposed to be... Yeah, exactly. They need to educate themselves. They need to read, because if only it's quite religious. If only they were enlightened by the truth. If only they would sort of hear the gospel of these new ideas, then they would see the error of their ways. They don't see that it could just be that other people have a different approach, or other people have a different opinion to them. But because they are so absolutely committed to these ideas, they believe that anybody who stands in the way of their progress needs to be silenced or demonized
or eliminated.
Exactly.
That's the worry, and that's actually why, as you say, the lens into totalitarian states like Maoist China, or anyone that lived through the Iron Curtain or the Cold War era in the Soviet Union, has a different take, and their antenna are much better actually sniffing it out. So I've seen that before. I know what that means, to go to work and not being able to speak your truth to colleagues. I can see that. When particularly, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it's not. Surely the people that are saying really it's a matter of education, you know, really you can't have that, you've got to be educated out. Surely they can see the totalitarian history. Maybe they just don't know.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, the army is approaching behind and they're facing in the wrong direction. Because I think that there's a sort of an expectation of what the great movements in history look like, whether it's communism or fascism, and that because of our education system being a bit naff, there is a sort of particular understanding that people have of what those things look like when they approach, and they wrongly think, I couldn't possibly be a part of that. If I was in that situation, that wouldn't have happened. They don't really understand, you know, what it must have been like to be in the early days of communism or the Russian Revolution, or to be in the early days of the French Revolution or fascism in Nazi Germany. They don't really have a proper perspective about that. And going back to Rod Dreher's brilliant book again, this is a point that he makes, is that if you talk to people who lived in these sorts of societies and saw the signs,
can recognize it,
then you realize that, you know, it's not always going to come in the same form, but you need to be able to tell, you know, the signs of things turning in the wrong direction. And this is what has been pointed out by people who did live in those countries, which is that we are seeing certain things now that are worrying because they resonate with things that have happened before. And we need to not be complacent or arrogant in thinking, or this is not going to happen here, or, you know, this isn't serious, we don't need to engage with this, or you know, this doesn't
matter.
Exactly. And I think
it doesn't matter.
I think people need to be more self-reflective in, you know, thinking about, you know, what these ideas mean when taken to their ultimate conclusion. They just need to have a little moment to self-reflect and try to see themselves in historical context. And I think this is a problem that, you know, you see throughout all parts of society at the moment, is that there is an arrogance and a hubris. So I can't remember who it was who described it as being Promethean, where people are so assured that they're right that everybody else must be wrong, and they can, you know, cancel people that they don't agree with, that they are confident that they know how to make the world right. And that's always a dangerous thing, to believe that you alone or your group alone know how to make the world into a kind of utopia.
No, I wrote, because I was rereading Burke's Reflections recently, and I wrote down a little snippet for this interview, because I want to just read it out, because I think not only is he right in his critique of the revolution, but it's so apt and it's beautifully written. So Burke said, he's talking about the progressives and revolutionaries, he says, wholly unacquainted with the world in which they are fond of meddling, and inexperienced in all its affairs on which they pronounce with so much confidence, they have nothing of politics but the passions they excite. So it's more heat than light, and it's very damaging. And I just think that's a brilliant quote. Do you like that?
It also touches on the classic sort of, and I'm very fond of this, the Burkean understanding of sort of the ecosystem of how society functions with its institutions and so on, which really goes to the heart of the purpose of the film that we made. That, again, it's the historical ignorance. There's lots of aspects to the historical ignorance of a lot of the sort of activism that we're seeing. Not because, I don't know whether it's willful or not, I think to some degree, as a sort of utopian thinking, it is ahistorical, because they tend to be by definition ahistorical. But there is a lack of willingness, or a lack of willingness to engage with, or a lack of understanding of the history of those institutions, why they're there, and a lack of generosity when it comes to their function and the sorts of, you know, our institutions in this country have given us a very distinctive British form of liberty that is extremely desirable to people all around the world, and that's because those institutions carved out a society that made that possible.
They were particular.
And this is I think, a very Burkean point, which is that they don't know what they're smashing up.
Exactly.
And revolutionaries never know what they're smashing up. The French Revolution as all revolutions do, turned it into a complete bloodbath and a disaster, because they are excited by these passions to smash things apart that they don't understand, and then they wonder where freedom has gone. But it's because you smashed up the things that gave us that freedom in the first place. And I think it's a misunderstanding to think that liberty can exist separately from the institutions that a society has accumulated over its history.
The society is the institution.
And there's a certain wisdom baked into those institutions. There's a wisdom baked into the social organisation of this country and of other countries as well. And so revolutionaries always throw the baby out with the bathwater. They want to raise everything to the ground, and then they wonder why, the revolutionaries themselves are getting the axe.
They will eventually. They have to turn because if they put the bar of correctness so high, we're all human, everyone, and that's the problem. Actually, there's no nuance in any of this. So if a sportsman, tweeted something wrong, clearly wrong, when he was 18, he must be condemned, and he must be. And there's very few people do. I mean, the Conservatives are being a little bit better on this recently, but I agree. I mean, but they're not. These movements are often very destructive. My criticism is actually both, that they're destructive and they don't really know what they're replacing them with. So we have to resist it. And I think institutions are important, which actually, in our own little way, in the Social Democratic Party, trying to rebuild something, is a critique of our existing political parties, which I don't think are very good. And so, actually, if you want to create something, we think that you've got to build an institution and work together to do it. So, listen, thank you very much for this interview. The film is Britain's Silent Culture Revolution, and you can see it on YouTube. And I would urge everyone to have a look at it. Brilliant film. And thank you very much, Emma Webb. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.